Let me bring in Dr. Tarpley into this conversation. Dr. Tarpley, the Libyan Transitional Council painstakingly showed its roadmap towards democracy as far as Libya goes at this meeting of the contact group on Libya. It's interesting, what they outlined was elections to be held despite Gaddafi staying in power. What do you make of that?
I think it's window dressing, because we have to remember that this Benghazi Rebel Council, I would simply call them the NATO puppets. These are not revolutionaries in any sense. This group around Jalil, Yunus, and Hifter that we have now, they are, of course, people who are co-sponsored by MI6, by the CIA, by the French DGSE, and with the input from the National Endowment for Democracy, as was quite correctly mentioned. But the embarrassment for the Western governments is that this group is chock full of al-Qaeda operatives and former veterans of the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, people who have been prisoners of war of the United States in Pakistan or held in Guantanamo Bay, are now in command of cities like Darna, for example, and Benghazi, I'm sure, also as well. I think it's going to be very hard to transfer money to such a group of dubious characters. Hillary Clinton obviously wants to give these people at least a good chunk of the $33 billion that the U.S. has seized. There is evidence that they're already stealing oil, selling it with the help of Qatar out there in the Gulf. But the word I had was that the rebels were about 3 to 4 weeks away from going bankrupt, so they need a cash infusion, and I'm not sure that they got it, because what they got seems to be humanitarian aid. I think, though, the other side, the military side, from NATO circles, we now hear that the bombing has reached a dead end. It has reached an impasse. And these NATO circles, speaking through various academics and so forth, want a new United Nations resolution that would allow then the ground invasion that we just heard Obama promising that he would never go with. So certainly the danger is therefore escalation, the ground invasion, the land war. And just let me add, here in Washington, we have a mood of, I call it hysteria, psychosis, and euphoria, all mixed, having mainly to do with this bin Laden story, which is too complex to go into. But I think Obama has now figured that he loves adulation. His narcissistic personality thrives on adulation, and he wasn't getting it for a long time, but now he's getting it, and I think it's going to be fairly easy for his handlers to get him to sign the paperwork for some kind of invasion of Libya. But I would also warn that that would probably be yet another disaster for the United States, given the obvious strategic problems of Libya.
Well, then all this, Dr. Tarpley, brings us back to the fact that the UN mandate does not require a regime change. However, any success that can be measured on the ground will only come through a viable regime change.
Well, the regime change is illegal, and at a certain point, the 5 permanent members can pass whatever they want. But the UN Charter, it seems to me, ought to trump their short-term machinations, and there it's very clear that the entire system is aimed at keeping people out of the internal affairs of sovereign states. It talks about international peace and security, which were never threatened by anything coming out of Libya, and therefore the sovereignty of Libya ought to be reasserted. You cannot, after all, be an aggressor on your own territory, and that is what these humanitarian international lawyers are trying to argue. That, of course, is a recipe for world chaos. It means trying to abolish the world system that we've had since 1648. We have sovereign states. I think we better keep them, because any attempt to supplant those with an empire is going to be catastrophic.
Right. Now, this also brings up the question about the fact that a lot of analysts say that the U.S. cannot afford to bring boots on the ground simply because it's stretched too thin with its wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, etc. So what do you say to those? Well, we'll go to Dr. Tarpley, please.
If I may, the original idea was, of course, yes, that the U.S. is too broke, too isolated, too hated, and so forth, to mount any serious land effort in Libya, and therefore the idea was do it on the cheap, get the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, get al-Qaeda, get a bunch of people from this Benghazi, Tobruk, Darna area who had, after all, mounted already a rebellion against Gaddafi in 1995, 96. Get them going again. These are the Harabi tribe and the Obeidat tribe. They're nostalgic for King Idris when they were more or less the ruling class at the court. They don't like the fact that the power has shifted to the Western tribes that are more favorable to Gaddafi. So they were supposed to be the NATO infantry, an irregular gaggle, as we saw, this rabble of guerrilla fighters practically in their pickup trucks out on the roads. Except that doesn't work. So it is like the Bay of Pigs once again. We had that 50 years ago now. Kennedy was convinced to send in an irregular force, and Alan Dulles and the people at the CIA convinced him that would be enough to overthrow Castro because there'd be an uprising, and it didn't work. And when it didn't work, Alan Dulles went back to Kennedy and said, now I want airstrikes and I want the Marines. And Kennedy said no to both, and by the way, you're going to be fired soon, so clean out your desk. Unfortunately, with Obama, we have someone who is such a puppet, such a weakling, that he literally takes orders from these people, even where he would be politically much smarter in the electoral sense, not to do this. So I think it's all it's drifting towards some tragic escalation.
But Dr. Tarpley, sorry to interrupt you there, but this sounds a lot like what the U.S. did in Afghanistan while fighting the Soviets. You'd think that the top military and intelligence brass in the U.S. would have learned by now.
Yes, you would, and I'm afraid they haven't, because these are their sort of obsessive thought patterns. I noticed the Italian Foreign Minister Frattini just promised his own domestic opposition that Italy would be out of the fighting within 3 to 4 weeks, and I think that's completely unrealistic. It's going to go on for quite a while. It may go on much longer than anybody thinks, and I would, of course, support an immediate cessation of this. NATO really needed to be a purely defensive alliance in northern in Europe, Western Europe, and North America. But we got into this out-of-area stuff, right? The NATO out-of-area deployments that have made NATO now into this colonialist and imperialist police force. It's a tragedy.
Well, then also, let's take a look at the other allies here that are playing a significant role. Specifically in Europe, we have Italy, Britain, also France being extremely proactive. Britain has already started supplying the revolutionaries with what it calls protective weapons. What do they have to gain from all this?
Well, the obvious thing is it's the old Suez Coalition from 1956. It's the British and the French, the unreconstructed imperialists, and one of the things they have to do is to expand themselves at the expense of the Italians. The poor Italians were the ones that are the former colonial power, and they had the majority of the oil interests were with them, and especially the oil production was giving Italy about 1/4 of all the oil it needed. So the idea is to push them out. There was a growing Chinese presence with about 40,000 workers who have all been driven out of the country now. So the Chinese were getting a large piece of it, and of course the U.S. policy in general is to try to kick the Chinese out of Africa in general to cut off their sources of oil and strategic raw materials. So we've got a kind of imperialist megalomania in London and Paris. They'd like to do it at the expense of the Italians and the expense of China. Germany, of course, in difficult straits because whatever the Merkel government might want to do, German public opinion, of course, is against it, and they seem not to be trying to creep in back through the back door under humanitarian cover. But the point is, if you send peacekeepers, so-called, into a country where they're not welcome, they're war makers, and they will be resisted, and I'm sure the Libyans will.
All right, Dr. Tarpley, how do you respond to those who say that when this uprising started in Libya, and Gaddafi's regime forces brutally cracked down upon the protesters. The world cried for world leaders to take decisive action against Gaddafi's regime. Now that they are taking some sort of action, we're all saying this is for global domination, etc., etc. How do you respond to that?
Well, this entire thing has been thoroughly fomented. It's part of the wave of putsches, color revolutions, palace coups that the CIA and the British have arranged all across the Arab world, but reaching into countries in Central Asia, Kazakhstan, and out to Indonesia and far beyond. It's essentially the leading edge of a war by the British and the United States against the existence of the nation state itself. Again, as we've known it since the Peace of Westphalia, that the empire no longer wishes to tolerate the existence of any even halfway independent countries. And of course, this entire thing in Libya was prepared. We have the Libyan government in exile, you might call it, that was here in Northern Virginia. They were contributed by the CIA. We have the DGSE contributing a subversion of a group of officers in the area of Benghazi to Darna. The British, of course, contribute the tribal basis, the connections to King Idris, who was a creature of the British, and then, of course, the al-Qaeda and the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group have been encouraged by the CIA. So it's basically 2 parts CIA, 1 part DGSE, 1 part MI6. Nothing spontaneous about this. And the goal was civil war. Who fired the first shot, I think, is immaterial. These people had done the rebellion in 95, 96. They knew what they were doing. And if they're complaining now, I would simply say, don't start a civil war if you are not prepared to accept the consequences. We had something like that here in the United States a century and a half ago. And civil war is the essence of anarchy. And once you start it, then the consequences will